That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Only Human. Today, we've got a special guest with us, Caddy Cadogan, is going to help us talk about leadership, specifically leadership in the military and how that transitions to the civilian sector. And we've had a lot of questions on that. One of the things we'll point out is that everybody that's ever come out of the military also had to go into it. So we all know about the transition initially from being a civilian into the military. And then there's that same culture shock, I think, once in a while when you come out of it. So we're going to talk today about leadership and how it differs between the military and civilian world. And we're going to have I think, a fun discussion. But like we always do, we want to start with our Blue Threat proverb of the week. And this week, it's a new one. And basically it says, who you are is where you were when. Who you are is where you were when. And that tells us that we're all a product of our backgrounds. We're all a product of the era we grew up in. I grew up in the 70s, Caddy a little bit later than that. We're all a product of the people we knew, and we're all a product of the organizations we were a part of. So we're going to talk about leadership in terms of who we are, where we were, when. With that, I'd like to invite Caddy into the podcast. Welcome to Only Human, Caddy.
Hey.
Full disclosure, Caddy works for us as the director of operations, and he's a master instructor, as well as a retired Marine Corps officer. So I don't want to steal his thunder. So Caddy, without further ado, you want to tell us a little bit about how you grew up, got into the Marine Corps. By the way, I wanted to tell you, I always wanted to be a Marine, but my mom wouldn't let me join the military. So I ended up in the Air Force. So that's my one bit of humor here. Tell us a little bit about how you got in, how you came through, and then we'll get into the leadership differences.
Yeah, Tony, thanks for having me. So, I joined the Marine Corps in 1996, right out of high school. I grew up in the Philly, Jersey area is kind of where I grew up. I wound up actually joining the Marine Corps out of the state of Virginia, moved there to Virginia, kind of finished up high school in my senior year. And like I said, 3 months after graduation, I was standing on those yellow footprints there in Parris Island, South Carolina. So that was kind of the beginning of my career there. First duty station, Marine Corps Air Station New River in Jacksonville, North Carolina. I joined in the air wing, as they call it in the Marine Corps, not the ground side, the air wing. I worked on helicopters and aircraft, putting weapons on them. So I was an aviation ordnanceman.
Wow. And so go ahead and continue and tell me a little bit about your 20 years, that as much as you can in a couple of minutes.
Yeah. So, like I said, first duty station there was in New River. Stayed enlisted there for the first 8 years of my career. Made it all the way up to E6, which is a staff sergeant in the Marine Corps. And then I did something that I always wanted to do, was become an officer. So there's a couple different routes to that. I didn't necessarily want to fly. I wanted to stay as an aviation ordnance guy. So I was able to do what they call the warrant officer program. All the services don't have that. It's an Army program, kind of started in the Army, but the Marine Corps and the Navy has it as well. So that's what I did. I put in for a warrant officer when I picked up staff sergeant, and I was fortunate enough to get selected right out of the gate, my very first time submitting. So that was great. After that, pinned on warrant officer, and I began going to squadron as the aviation ordnance officer. Normally, most shops, I'd have anywhere from 25 to 30 Marines under my charge. Did that all the way up to the rank of captain. So you're probably wondering, how in the world did you get from warrant to captain? So there's actually another program in the Marine Corps where you can go from warrant ranks to the commission ranks. They call it the limited duty officer program. So once again, it's another package. I put that in. Took me 2 times this time to actually get it. But after my second try, I got selected for captain. And I wound up finishing off my career as a major.
Wow.
In the Marine Corps.
Pretty interesting. I mean, the military does give you a lot of different paths to leadership. And the entire time you were dealing with bombs and things like that, right?
Correct, correct. Yep. Missiles, bombs, rockets, bullets on anything from a fixed wing aircraft to a helicopter.
Wow. So as we get into discussing leadership, uh, I want to start with the other side of it, followership. And I'll start with my story a little bit. I came in, I was a 90-day wonder out of officer training school back when Ronald Reagan said if you had two hands, a head, and a heartbeat, you could fly airplanes for Uncle Sam. So I took him up on that. And I remember, you talked about the yellow footprints there at Paris Island. I was not too far from where I'm at right here, down at Lackland Air Force Base, which is the gateway to the Air Force for just about everybody. It's where your basic training occurs. And I remember, the haircut. I remember the yelling, stand in line, you're marching like an idiot. And that first week or two, I realized that this was a completely different culture and that substandard performance was not going to be tolerated for long. They expected mistakes. They pointed them out to us. And of course, we got better. And once you swing into that, at least for me, it was pretty easy to follow directions, right? Going from that to actually giving directions was a whole nother process, and we'll get into that. But there's nothing like that in the civilian world. They don't really teach you followership. So can you comment at all on that from Marine Corps perspective and maybe what you've seen in terms of followership on the civilian side?
Sure. So followership, it's funny because there's a saying that you cannot be a good leader until you are a good follower, right? So you've got to be able to follow direction before you can start giving directions. And I would say my experience in the Marine Corps was kind of unique because I'm what they call a Mustang. So a Mustang is someone who was enlisted first and then became an officer. So I started off at the lowest levels as a private, right? Following directions, doing what I'm told. And I was able to grow in the Marine Corps to become a leader. But I think it made me a better leader because I was able to comprehend and understand where my troops had been because I had walked a mile in their shoes, right? So I had done the things that they had done.
So there's nothing like that experience, at least in most companies that I've ever worked with, and I've also worked with some government civilian organizations, as you're aware, on the civilian side. On the civilian side, it seems to me that piece of the puzzle might be missing. If we screwed things up, they beat us a little bit left and right, got us back online, on track, and we move forward. Now, if you did a second or a third time, the beatings were a little bit beatings. They don't actually beat you, for those of you, but they might as well, right? The civilian side, there's nothing like that. People make mistakes. They may get counseled or something like that. Do you see that as a possible weak point of civilian side, or is that something that was beat too hard into us in the military?
No, I don't think it would be too hard for us in the military. I think it is a weak spot and something that the civilian sector would do well to adopt. In the civilian sector, a lot of followership is based on credentials, right? You're followed because of the letters behind your name, CEO, PhD, those types of things evoke followership in the civilian sector. Where in the military, it's different. It's more of experience based. Right? I follow you because you've been there, done that. You've seen these things. You have that experience. And because of that, I follow you. So,
okay. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there. I want to go for a second to this idea of, we're followers, but we're also doers, right? For me, I came into an airplane. I had to operate that airplane. For you, you had to load those bombs. And we got pretty good at those things. And the next thing you know, somebody says, hey, you're pretty good at this stuff. We want you to lead others to do it. That, to me, was the first major transition from being a technical expert to having to deal with leadership and people. How did you handle that?
So I will tell you, Tony, that was a struggle for me. And I say that from a point of I was a perfectionist. I had a near miss when I was in at a very young age, 19 years old as a PFC. Almost blew myself up. And because of that, I took a different path. So I was very perfectionist as far as my technical expertise, what I wanted done. So it was hard for me to let go of that, right? And teach somebody else how to do that. Because as soon as you see them not following the process or the checklist or making that mistake, you just want to jump in and say, hey, just move aside. I've got it. I know how it's supposed to be done. I'm going to do it. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be there forever. You're going to move on. You're going to do different things. So it's very much about being able to teach somebody else how to perform that job. That's a hallmark of a great leader.
Yeah, so almost all of us in the military, at least the two of us for sure, that stepping stone to leadership was becoming an instructor.
Yep.
Right? You're a doer, and now you're a teacher. And you're exactly right. Every time somebody would get off course, I'd want to grab the yoke or the stick and pull them back on course or pull the throttle back.
Right.
And from there, oftentimes we'll become evaluators.
Mm-hmm.
And those are kind of stepping stones to leadership, right? Once again, I think in the civilian world, they may not get that level of experience. So let's burn this out a little bit. I think let me just ask you this rather than give you my perception. Do you think there's an anti-military bias out there in the civilian world?
I do. And I say that because we are a very social media driven society. People believe what they see on TikTok and Facebook and on movies, right? So how are military movies projected? How it's always, tough, authoritarian, follow orders, that type of thing. But you and I both know that really isn't it. Sure, there's portions of it that are like that, but people in the military are critical thinkers. They think on their feet. There's a lot of similarities in the military to the corporate sector that I think a lot of times civilians don't appreciate because of what they've seen, right? And when I say what they've seen, it's what they've seen on Facebook or what they've seen on that one movie, Few Good Men, right? For Marines, it's Few Good Men. Now, you talk about Marines, that's the movie that references us. Are there some Right. Are there some Colonel Jessups out there? Yeah, there's probably a couple, but by and large, that's not it.
So, in my entire 21-year Air Force career, I don't think I ever gave a direct order.
All right. Yeah.
You have to do this, right? And I think, that might shock some people.
Exactly.
Most of the influence we have as leaders is the same as you're going to see anywhere, right? You want to be a good role model.
Yep.
You clearly articulate what the mission is. You want to clearly articulate expectations, and people do the right things.
Right.
I think definitely we are a lot better at critiquing mistakes, identifying them, calling them out on ourselves as well as others. But man, if you flew something poorly in my line of work during the debrief, somebody puts a finger in your chest, regardless of where you're at in the rank structure, and they said, hey, Bubba, I expected a little bit more from you, right, on this one. And I could tell you 100 of those stories. But have you had any experiences? I mean, how many direct orders did you have to get?
Like few. Like I say, in 24 years, probably a handful, right? Because that's not what you want. The military doesn't want robots. We want people who can think. I want to be able to give you my overall intent. And in the military, we call it commander's intent. I know you're familiar with that as a war college graduate. You give them that intent and you give them the room to be able to make decisions. Right? And that's what leaders should do. And that's civilian or military. That doesn't matter. It goes both ways.
So why then, maybe your transition out was different than mine. Mm-hmm. But during for those of you that don't know, when you're getting out of the military, you have to go to all these programs that say, here's how we're going to make you a successful civilian. Why in those programs do they tell you to tone down your military stuff? Get all the military stuff out of your resume. Grow your hair a little bit. Wear casual clothes. Don't polish your shoes. Now, I mean, it's seriously. They try to say, hey, downplay this. Why do you think that is?
I think that is because, so one, it kind of differs where you got out, right? So the E4 that does 4 years is going to be a little different than the sergeant major who did 26 years, right? So the sergeant major that did 26 years, yeah, there's probably going to be a little bit of demilitarizing that he's going to need to do, because he has to realize that his colleagues that he's going to go work with aren't Marines. They're not troops. All right. So there's a different way and a different method that he has to convey his message. But I think the message is the same. The message is the same. He just has to learn how to convey it differently.
Yeah. I mean, you and I both go out and talk to a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And in our bios, it tells them who we are, right? But even if you and I didn't know each other and we ran into each other at one of these conferences, how long would it take you to figure out that I was prior military?
Probably all of 2 minutes. Yeah. A few things would come out of your mouth and we know.
Yeah. So same. What do they say? Game recognizes game.
Yeah.
The idea that somehow we should mask our military background, I think, is a major flaw in thinking on how the military tries to prepare us for the civilian world. But there is a piece of this with leadership that struck me really hard, and that is the culture of the military is significantly different than any civilian culture I've ever been in. And for me, my experience was, I got out of the Air Force and I immediately went to work for a large government organization, the U.S. Forest Service, where, I directed the largest non-military government aviation program in the world. And the first meeting I went to, I'm sitting there and it's 5 minutes to time when the meeting starts. There's nobody in the room.
Yeah.
Right? Then there's the meeting start time and there's only a few people in the room. And I'm becoming very agitated by that. And then about 15 minutes later, everybody rolls in and we start the meeting. That wasn't the only thing. I mean, it's not just people being on time. It's people answering questions and being open and forthright. And there's a lot of guarded communications or just failure to communicate in the civilian world I never experienced in the military world. So my natural leadership tendency is, why can't you guys show up on time? Why can't you answer an email? Why can't you? The problem wasn't them. The problem was me. I was in a new culture and I was having a hard time adapting.
Right.
Did you experience any of that?
I did. So you know a little bit about this, but before I started working with Convergent, my very first job out of the military, I worked for a local company here in Pensacola where I live. Small company, tech company that also did some training. I led a small group of curriculum writers writing some curriculum for the Navy. So something I was very familiar with as a naval instructor. But yeah, a lot of the same things that you talked about, people not being on time, people not answering questions directly, people not doing their assignments when they're supposed to. So there were certain things that I had to assign to curriculum writers that had to be done in a certain amount of time. And then that time would come up, I'd ask for it, and it's always an excuse. Or, well, I couldn't do it because of this or because of that. So it was hard to not, in the Marine Corps, we're famous for our knife hand, right? It was hard to not kind of come out with the knife hand and be like, okay, this was the deadline. Like, what are you doing? What's going on here? So it was, you had to find a different way to present it. So like I said, the message is the same. I still have to communicate that this needs to be done, but I have to find a different way to say it and do it.
Yeah. And I guess you made me think of something. It's not like we got everything done on time in the military either.
Of course not. No.
But the big difference was if somebody started to get behind, they would tell you, right? As soon as they knew they weren't going to meet the deadline, they would let you know in time to get more resources or adjust your deadline that followed their deadline, right? And so that was a big thing that I saw and something that I try to communicate to everybody that I've had the opportunity to lead in the civilian world. And I've been out of the military longer than I was in. It tells you how old I am. But if you're not going to meet a deadline, the minute you have any doubt,
Right.
communicate it. Right? Bad news doesn't improve with age. That was a good thing. So it sounds like, hey, if we could just get everybody in the civilian world to recognize what a great followership, leadership, communication world we came out of, and they could all adjust to the way we do it in the military, everything would be great, right? What negatives do you see that you maybe had to rub out a little bit from your military background and leadership preparation to function well in the civilian world?
I almost hate to say this, but I'm going to. I almost had to lower my expectations a little bit. So let me explain that. Not that I didn't expect more out of my colleagues. I had to take my expectation off of it, right? And that's something that I did a lot of when I first joined my civilian job. What is Caddy's expectation of this? How would he do it? And I tried to use that paintbrush to paint everybody else. And you just can't do that. You have to kind of go into the organization, go into the culture, kind of see what's happening first there. So watch and observe, and then try to blend in first before you can go in and start making changes. So that was the hardest thing for me, especially I was put in a leadership position right from the beginning. I was senior ISD team lead with 7 people under me. So I was put into a leadership position right from the beginning, but I couldn't go in there and just kick the door open and say, this is the way it's done. You have to do it this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I had to go in and kind of watch a little bit and see how they worked and then formulate a plan. And that's what I did. That's what helped me be successful there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the first 6 months I was out, we were fighting forest fires and having all kinds of things going on. It's a very dynamic, fast-paced job that I stepped into. And I was always frustrated. I always went home mad every day because there was things that were supposed to be getting done that weren't getting done. And so my stress level was through the roof. And I said, what is going on here? And what was going on was I was just like you. I had expectations that the world I came from should be the world that I'm in, and it wasn't that way. Once you figure out the rhythm and the flow of everything, it seemed to be a lot better. I've got a couple more questions for you with regards to the vital things we should bring with us and the things that we should leave behind as leaders. And we're going to do that in just 1 minute, right after a word from our sponsor.
Have you ever finished the latest bestseller on habits or personal performance and asked, yeah, okay, but how? All the improvements you visualize while reading the books require one thing to achieve in your own life: deliberate practice, a new way of focusing attention inside the routine to drive consistent improvement with every experience. Focused on getting the biggest impact from your career development opportunities, the Deliberate Practice of Professionalism course from Convergent Performance teaches you the steps and requirements to achieve improvement and mastery of your targets. Discover how deliberate practice can springboard your improvement efforts, no matter what they might be or your current skill level. Join us on our website at convergentperformance.com and click the link for e-learning to sign up for this exciting program today.
All right, like I said, I want to try to pick up on a couple of things. If you had 2 or 3 things that you would say, absolutely, you're glad you brought with you, and 2 or 3 things that you had to discard from your leadership training in the military coming into the civilian world, what would they be?
So let's start with the things I had to discard. I had to realize that people aren't walking around with ranks anymore. So you're not wearing one and they're not wearing one. So essentially, unless you're like the CEO or one of the C-suite, you're kind of all the same. So I had to let that structure kind of go a little bit. Now, and obviously, there's different levels and places, but by and large, everybody's kind of in the same pool. So I had to let that go. I think one of the things that I kept that I think did well for me is always trying to realize where people came from and try to get to the bottom of that when it came to conflict resolution. So when it came to trying to figure out knowing your Marines, knowing a little bit about their personal lives and that kind of stuff, that's something in the civilian sector that isn't really preached a lot, but as a military leader, it was. You had to know, your troops' names, the kids' names, their wife's name, all of that stuff. You had to know them as a person. I'm glad I brought that with me because in the civilian sector, that's been very popular. But it's kind of uncommon when you start asking about themselves. They're like, it's almost like, well, why are you asking me that? Like, what does that have to do with my job? Well, I just want to get to know you. I'm going to be working with you. I want to get to know you. How many kids you have, what grade your kids in, those kind of things. What do you do for hobbies? It's one of those things of trying to get to know somebody on a personal level, because if you do, I think the working relationship is just that much better and easier. So.
Yeah, let me just comment on that. I think you're right if you ask personal questions, people are like,
they're kind of scared. It's like weird.
What's going on? I remember initially when I joined the Forest Service, I said, where's everybody go after work? How do you guys socialize? And they go, we go home. What do you mean? We were used to hanger flying afterwards, and kids there was a Robin Hood sandwich shop and Anthony's Pizza at the commissary. You'd see people at lunch, and your kids would all go to school together, and you'd know everything about everybody, and you wanted to, right? And all of a sudden, there's this social distance, and even more so today with all the polarization that's going on. People are afraid to speak their minds. They really don't want to tell you more than they're comfortable with, and they're not comfortable telling you very much. So that makes it hard. I personally still think it's vitally important to do that work. You just have to be careful how you do it.
Absolutely. Right? No, you make a good point. I got to share this story with you, Tony, about that, about this topic. So when I was a brand new warrant officer, I was going on my first deployment as an officer, right? So it was my first time leading troops in combat, going to Iraq, right? And before we went, my boss was a major, Major Bull Hughes. Bull was his call sign. Bull in China shop. That's another story. But anyway, he said that I had to call each one of my troops' parents, let them know that they were going on deployment, where we were going on deployment, the approximate time we were going to be out, and to assure them that I was going to take care of them. I had to do that for 25 of my Marines that were under me. I will never forget that exercise. And I tell you what, I think it made me a better officer because I made those 25 calls, and it was very interesting. A couple I was met with a little bit of, animosity, like, why are you calling me type thing? Like, I don't want to hear from you all. Call me when you get back. Like, I don't want to hear this. From all the way to, that was awesome. Thank you for doing that. Like I'm at ease now that knowing that, you're taking a personal interest in my son or daughter. So that was when it talked about knowing people and knowing your folks and building that personal relationship, vitally important. I'll never forget that.
There's another piece of this that I think is important from a leadership perspective, especially for those that are unfamiliar with any military background other than what they've seen Hollywood produce, right? And this is real. I mean, one of the things that Hollywood gets right is that military people, at least you and I, there's a lot of functions maybe that don't deal in life and death, but we do, right? We're close to the edge, and we know that our performance could literally result in someone's death or our own, or severe injuries or whatever. So this life or death, high stakes environment that we operate in really gives some clarity to leadership, right? Because you know what's on the line and you take it seriously. And we've all been to funerals of people that didn't take it seriously. You've told your story about having a near-death experience. I had a couple of my own. So we know it's real. We know the threat is real. And I think there's positive and negative sides to that mindset coming into a civilian world where it's much more nuanced, right? Is the quarterly profit or the viability of your company, is that a life or death situation? Is mentoring someone who's struggling as opposed to, hey, we just need to get rid of this person. It's different. And I wonder sometimes whether that environment we come out of, who we are is where we were when, right? This environment of excellence in all you do, which is more than just a phrase, right? It's a way we keep each other safe and stay alive. Suddenly we sort of want that wherever we go. And maybe ex-military people don't have as much connoisseurship or nuance in communicating in different ways.
So I will say that there's a time and place for all of that, right? So everything isn't a life or death situation, and it doesn't necessarily need to be treated as such. However, some of the traits in the way that you think in a life or death situation, like the critical thinking on your feet, being decisive, those qualities translate well into any scenario in the civilian sector. All right, you want people to think on their feet, and when things seem to be high pressure, high stress, they're able to bring that down to a medium level, think clearly, and execute. So that's what the life or death situations in the military teach you.
Yeah, I think the other thing, perhaps it's a misconception, maybe it's not, is that the military is all about obedience and discipline, right? Again, the Hollywood version of the drill sergeant or the Colonel Jessup out of A Few Good Men, which in many ways actually does stifle creativity and innovation inside the military, right? You hear a lot of guys that say, I want to just stay low key and off the radar, right? And that's not necessarily what we want in the civilian world. So how do you respond to the criticism that's out there that says, military people are all about, discipline and wanting to follow orders, and that's not conducive to running a good civilian operation?
The first thing I would say is stop watching so many movies. Don't believe everything you see, right? Because that's where you got that from. But in all seriousness, though, at least in the Marine Corps, we have these things called 14 leadership traits. None of the traits are obedience and discipline, right? So at the end of the day, what the military really is trying to bring is well-rounded leaders. That's what we encourage, and that's what we want. That's the part you don't see unless you're in it. We want well-rounded leaders where discipline and obedience are important, but they're not the only thing. Things like judgment, dependability, bearing, integrity, decisiveness, tact, initiative, all of these things are taught in all of our leadership academies and schools from the time that you're a NCO all the way up until you're a general. So I would say that a lot of that's myth. It's not all about just those two things. There's many, many factors and traits that go into making a well-rounded leader.
Okay, well, we're just about almost out of time. We can go on a little bit longer if we want, but with deference to our audience who might be listening to us on a computer to work, we'll wrap it up here in a second. Caddy, I'll let you go first. Anything that I didn't ask that you wish I would have, or any pearls of wisdom about leadership in this regard that you want to?
Just one thing, and I think so. I had the privilege of serving with a lot of Marines in my time, my 24 years. So you see a lot of come and go, right? And some of the ones that go, maybe after 4 or 8 years. One of the biggest things that I had to do interviews with all of those that got out, right? And just try to determine what their next plan was, why they're getting out of the military, those type of things. And one of the most common things that I always heard was, I can't have somebody telling me what to do. This structure, this rigid hierarchy is just too much. I'm going to go in the civilian sector where it's a little bit more free. Also a myth. That's what I would tell them. Unless you're going to open up your own business and you plan on being Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, you are going to be listening to someone. All right. It may not be as rigid a hierarchy as it is in the military, but there is a hierarchy. There's a boss, there's a manager, an assistant manager, and then there's workers, right? So I think that structure is relevant. I think it's also valid in the civilian sector, even though it's applied differently. It's always going to be there, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I guess my one thing, it's probably more than one thing, but I'll try to wrap it into one thing, is that in the military, I didn't have a choice but to lead. Starting out when you become an aircraft commander to other levels, you are expected. It is a mandate of the job. It's a role. It's a responsibility. Like I said, life or death is on the line. So you don't get a choice, right? There's not a lot of management training we get in the military, right? Because we operate in a dynamic situation, and you talked about it, right? Where change management is pretty much the way of life for a leader, right? You've got a troop that just got a DUI or got in a car accident or has a family emergency, and suddenly you have to shuffle and do everything with that. I think there are a lot of people. I'll say one more thing on the military side. When you're put in a leadership position, regardless of what it is,
Right.
you are forced to lead. In the civilian side, that's not true, right? You can sit in a leadership position and manage your life away, right? Without trying to promote progressive change or improve safety or improve quality or better financial outcomes, because it's safe to not push the envelope, right? And so I think the one thing that is critical for making the transition out is that you continue to be able to lead and also understand why other people don't, right? There are people that are just counting the days till they can get their retirement, and they don't want to rock the boat and they don't want to make change, which is why I think that the blend is pretty good, right? When you've got a few people that are ready, willing, and able to lead, and you've got people that, hey, that's not my gig, I think that can make for a pretty nice, diverse mix in an organization, even though I look at people like that as soulless robots, timid, and I've had to overcome that myself as well. So at any rate, well, thanks, Caddy, so much for joining us here at Only Human. We'll probably have you back. There's a lot more we can talk about, not only around leadership, but about high-stakes decision-making and safety and quality and all those things. And we'll be sure to have you back on another episode. But that's pretty much a wrap here for us on Only Human. We hit a lot of key topics. We exposed and busted a lot of myths, and hopefully left everybody with a few things to think about. So until next time, keep getting better every day with what you do, with what you have, and I'll see you soon.